Well, hello, everybody. My name's Jeff Lewis. I'm a financial advisor here in our Rockford, Illinois office. I just want to thank you all for joining our webinar today, Gearing Up for Retirement. We've got a lot of good material for you that we'll plan to go through with you. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Jake Loescher, as well. Jake, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, Jeff. Thanks so much. Yeah, looking forward to discussing obviously a super important topic and one we often answer questions for. So I think we're going to have a great session here today.
Great. Yeah. So just kind of setting the stage for what we've got covered, what we're planning to cover with you guys today. First, just always, starting with creating that vision of what is retirement going to look like. And then we kind of delve into the details from there. So I just want to keep this really high level at the beginning, Jake. And I know you've got some really good thoughts on how to create a vision and where to go from there. So how about you kind of give us your insight on this and how you typically approach this when you're discussing this with your clients?
Sure. So I'd say the idea of retirement starts at some point. Usually it starts the moment someone gets a full-time job. They think, how long am I going to have to work? When will I ultimately be able to live off a nest egg of assets I saved, plus maybe other income sources? Yeah, perhaps what was my parents' situation, and how did my grandparents retire, and like how do all these different aspects of what ultimately is impressed upon me will it apply towards my own future, my own retirement? And oftentimes people have identified that timeline and want to retire, but then it's really not full. So perhaps there's not a lot that's been filled in with what they'll do when they're retired or what retirement will look like after they've decided to stop working. There's so many facets to this creating your vision of what retirement will ultimately be, besides just knowing when you're going to stop working. And that's really where the skill set of a financial advisor comes in. So Jeff, it really starts with this idea of kind of financial well-being. Now, we love to have in-depth values-based conversations with clients. Not everyone, of course, is super motivated to feel like they're being analyzed or going through psychotherapy with an individual that isn't otherwise a therapist. But for us to really understand what motivates someone and what will help drive towards long-term retirement, we have to really have a very good understanding of who they are and what's important to them. What are the values that drive them? And it starts with this idea of financial well-being. And we've identified there's kind of 8 key dimensions of financial well-being, whether it's emotionally, how someone feels about maybe relationships, or environmentally, the people in the community they're going to surround themselves with. Spiritually is more how someone will spend their time, not necessarily a deity or a religion, but more how they will spend their time with either those they care about or perhaps organizations that are important. Of course, there are other aspects, physical, retirement, intellectually, how you'll be stimulated with your brain, socially, the individuals that you surround yourself with, the financial aspect, which is what most people think we do, and frankly, what most people look for us, our services, but also kind of on an occupational basis, whether someone is interested in creating a different future, and maybe the future that they have up until the point of retirement may not be the end of their story. So these 8 dimensions of financial well-being really drive a lot of discussions and decisions. But this is, really the start. I'm in the next slide. I'm kind of reminded of this idea that when someone hires a financial advisor, they think of really what's in the green bar here listed. So it's whether you should retire, or how and when you will take Social Security, or what a pension strategy election might look like, or how much income could you draw off your portfolio. It's all these tactics that advisors get really excited about, and frankly, we go to school for. Things we learn about tax code or learn about how to build portfolios. Those are things we're excited to share with you and help put in place from a strategic perspective. But if we don't focus on the things that are at the bottom of this slide, then we are doing a disservice to you in helping live kind of what's in the yellow bar, your ideal future. And if anyone remembers the tale of Alice in Wonderland, they probably remember the Cheshire Cat. And when Alice came up to the Cheshire Cat, she didn't know which direction to go. And the Cheshire Cat says, well, if you don't know which direction will go, any road will do. And that's really what retirement looks like. It's any road will do if we don't have a plan which is rooted not only in your financial well-being, but in about 16 different core values that are represented towards the bottom of the slide. Now, 16 core values actually came out of a research study through the University of Michigan, but it's this idea that we're all driven by different values, which are generally timeless, They can change depending on circumstances that someone may experience either personally or financially. But values and understanding what the core ones that will be that'll drive your plan help to identify really personalized goals. And when we have a really personalized goals that's specific, that's measurable, actionable, realistic, time bound, smart goals as we like to call them, then we can then start aligning strategies. So when someone should retire or how they should, ultimately elect Social Security benefits. And we can run analysis and try to put together different financial calculations around this. But all of that has to be supported by those things that are most important to that person. And we spend a lot of time as a financial advisor trying to figure that piece out so that we can help continue to motivate you towards whatever that ideal future will be. And also recognize that there are points in time where retirement might be the goalpost. That might be the final end of what you think your story should be. But as soon as you get to retirement, the goalpost moves. So we continue to evolve these conversations and drive towards this. But the element of kind of creating your vision is super important. So I want to be more specific on what I mean at this point. So when we think about goals that are supported by values, let's say we have a conversation and we identify different values. Well, say, for example, one value is to support and protect those you love. Well, trying to understand what that value means to you and why did you choose it, perhaps we then align this goal. Well, let's review the opportunity to potentially purchase additional life insurance by the end of this year. Because if it's about protecting individuals you love, and if it was this person's interpretation, maybe you need to make sure, that you have some type of life insurance put in place to cover a potential mortgage, or perhaps one spouse still is working and has an income while the other one is not. So this idea of making sure that protecting those you love might mean purchasing additional life insurance, that's a goal where then we can run analysis and different strategies to impact that goal. How about dedicating more time to those you care about? That's very clearly a motivator for most people to retire. It's, well, to be more with my kids or my family, or to spend more time with my loved ones. Well, what about an actionable goal? How about I identify at least 2 nights per week to spend with my spouse, perhaps enjoying hobbies? If really dedicating more time to those you care about is a value that's important to you, here's a very specific goal to align with that value. Avoiding being a burden on family. This is an important one, and oftentimes we discuss at the point of someone's retirement, but they're thinking 20 to 30 years down the road. So this idea of avoiding being a burden on the family might come back with a more actionable goal like this. So it might be to review your existing estate plan. Perhaps you put a plan in place when maybe you first had kids, or when you first were married, or perhaps you're single and you're trying to figure out exactly what an estate plan might look like, and you put one in place, but maybe it's been 15 to 20 years since you last updated it. So reviewing the existing estate plan, maybe updating it with new provisions, identifying those people that'll help you carry out your estate plan, or perhaps it's based on new estate planning law passed in the last 3 to 4 years. Reviewing those critical provisions are key towards aligning with the value of avoiding being a burden on your family. Spending without guilt. That's a tough one. Oftentimes when people retire, and this is part of what Jeff's going to get into next, it's this idea of, okay, well, how can I spend what I have accumulated? Going from saver to spender is a very difficult thing to do. Well, let's identify all the things that are important to me, which we'll dig into in more detail here in just a moment. But then perhaps there's an amount of my budget I can spend carefree, and it's not going to impact my long-term plan. Well, let's identify what that amount is. Let's work towards establishing within the budget the amount you can just choose to spend without impacting the long-term plan. And finally, making work optional. Retirement, I think in the last generation, maybe the silent generation, was a time that was written down. Perhaps it was baked into a pension plan, and you had to retire by 65 years old, and that was the line drawn in the sand. Retirement now is different. Most people identify retirement as a moment of achieving financial independence, or perhaps in making work optional. So maybe financial independence is just this identity of, I know that I have saved enough by a certain time period so that I no longer need to work, but maybe I'll choose to work because of all the other elements of well-being that are important, the social aspects, as I was mentioning before, the intellectual benefits. Financial independence is much more of the definition of retirement today, and probably will be moving forward. But an actionable goal to accomplish that is identifying how much you might need to save by 2025 to achieve financial independence. So I think you can see that although advisors get really excited about all the calculations and analysis that we can run for you, if we don't have a really good understanding of the values that drive your plan, which is based kind of in understanding what your well-being is financially and with all other aspects, then we can align very specific goals that will help you reach an ideal future a lot sooner. Jeff, I know we talked a little bit about here about, trying to spend without guilt and identifying spending mechanisms and perhaps a bit more on the strategy side, but I know you have some thoughts on kind of these details and how it can actually get down into the details.
Yeah, and I'm going to get to that in just one moment. I just wanted to take a moment. I love the bullet point on spending without guilt, because I think so many people think of their financial advisor as the person that says, you need to save, you need to save, you need to save, and you can only spend X amount. And it's really a shift in mindset, as you mentioned, like encouraging people that you work with, that you have the ability and you have the permission. It's okay. It's your money at the end of the day, but to make sure that you're not, for a lot of people at the end of the life, dying with a bunch of money left over isn't always necessarily the goal. And there could have been things they could have been doing throughout life that they would have enjoyed more that maybe they didn't do or that they regret. So I love talking about that because I know it's an important conversation to have with so many people. But I think just from an overall spending perspective, I think where it probably starts is identifying your needs versus your wants, and then ultimately your wishes. And the way that I think about this is needs are obviously, this is keeping your lights on. This is keeping, your belly full with food, water, pop, soda, glass of wine, whatever you choose to gives you pleasure from that perspective. Like that's what I think about, the needs. The wants are, generally speaking, those are things like travel, maybe we buy a more luxurious car or maybe a higher end car than what we're used to. Those may be wants. And then obviously wishes can be anything from a second home to maybe it's a boat somewhere or whatever it may be. So for some people, it's, potentially starting a business and staying active and keeping them engaged from an employment perspective. And so when I think about this, it really comes to identifying these three buckets of how am I going to be spending money? How am I going to identify the different categories that I have? And then from there, how do I prioritize them within the means that I have to live on, personal savings, personal assets, Social Security, pensions, things of that nature. And I think that's a really unique process that every individual who's embarking on a new retirement journey should go through. And I think it can really help clarify a lot of the questions that people have as they start that journey. From there, kind of talking about what are the resources current, or where are the resources currently going? What am I spending money on? There seems to be this belief that when you get into retirement, you're going to be spending less money. And I just completely disagree with that. And I think it couldn't be further from the truth. In most circumstances, what I've seen is people's monthly expenses either stay the same or maybe even go up a little bit, especially in those early years of retirement, because that's when you are more active. That's when you're able to do a lot of the traveling and do a lot of the things that you're able to enjoy. So I think planning for those things and identifying, okay, what are the expenses that I can control, maybe that are deemed as variable expenses, going out to eat and things of that nature, versus what are the expenses that I know are going to come in, things like a mortgage or utility bills or maybe a car payment. Eventually the car payment will fall off, but then you're going to have to get another new car at some point. So those things, how do you include all of that as it looks within your retirement plan, are important. And going through those exercises and trying to identify different spending levels at different points in life can be really important. And I think what a lot of people find is once they get into retirement, it is a little bit of a different lifestyle. It's certainly a lifestyle adjustment because you have more time on your hands from the perspective of maybe you're not necessarily committed to the 8-to-5 job that you were used to. However, at the same time, I think you'll find that your time fills up pretty quickly through volunteer efforts, traveling, spending time with friends and family. A lot of people always say to me like, man, I'm more busy than I ever have been, and I'm not even working. The only flip side to that is I think a lot of people are now finding more enjoyment in the things that they're doing because they're spending more time with friends, with family, with loved ones. And so that's obviously really important. And then from the perspective of having different buckets that you can pull money from to obviously, pay for the expenses is obviously critically important at a financial level. I think this is probably where, people like Jake and I put our nerd hats on, and this is really where we geek out and we think it's a lot of fun, but you kind of got your 401ks, your IRAs, SEPs, things of that nature. Those are all taxed at your ordinary income rates. Distributions from those buckets are taxed at the highest income tax rates that are currently in the IRS tax code. And then you got things like Social Security. Some may have pensions, some may have annuities. For the most part, a lot of those income sources are also taxed at the ordinary income tax rates. So from that perspective, if you're thinking about taxes solely, all of those buckets of money are taxed very similarly. And then we've got kind of two different buckets. So one's your standard taxable brokerage account, things like a individual account that's titled to you individually, or maybe you jointly own it with a spouse. If you have a trust account set up, this bucket of money is taxed at what's called more preferential capital gains tax rates. So depending on what your tax bracket is for the year, capital gains in this bucket of money is taxed at either 0, 15, or 20%. And that really just goes back to what your total income is. And as dividends and interest get paid to this bucket, you pay taxes on it throughout the year. Whereas in your IRAs, you don't actually pay tax on that money until you take the money out. So there's a little bit of different nuances that you have to think of. And I always say coordinating which one of these buckets should you be taking money from first is probably one of the early questions early on that you try identifying as part of a distribution planning strategy once you're retired, because it's important. It's important to know that, having flexibility with different buckets and pulling money from different buckets allows you flexibility from a tax perspective, but you also don't want to deplete one of these buckets right away because, well, now you're kind of pigeonholing yourself later on in life where maybe you only have pre-tax or IRA monies, and all of the income that you have is now subject to the highest ordinary income tax rates. So there's some thoughtfulness that goes into this. Obviously, there's some artistic, nature to this as well. But those are the first two buckets. And then obviously the last one, and this has become more prevalent as they become more popular is kind of the health savings accounts and the Roth buckets. From a tax perspective, they're the most tax advantageous. Roth money grows tax free. When you take distributions after age 59 and a half, you don't pay income tax on it at that time. So more and more people are asking the question of how do I get more money in these tax-free buckets? And so a lot of that comes with, planning years ahead of time. And so it's just important to give that, the thoughtfulness that it deserves over that course of time. I mentioned different distribution rules different distribution tax rates. From a rules perspective, IRAs, pre-tax, 401ks have the most distribution limitations. It means they come with the most rules. Roth IRAs also fall in this bucket because you have to get to a certain age of 59 and a half under most circumstances to access the money penalty free. Obviously, there's exceptions, but for the most part, you can't really touch that money until you're 59 and a half. Whereas in that taxable bucket, there is no age requirement, which is kind of nice. This is the bucket of money that you can access at any point in life. And there's no penalty for taking money out early. Really, it just comes down to the question of, okay, well, what's the tax liability if I am to take money from this bucket? And how does it affect me from my overall financial perspective and my overall financial picture? And how does this all intertwine back into each other? So when we think about, the different buckets and the different planning strategies, that come along with this, one of the biggest ones for a lot of people who retire prior to age 65 is qualifying for lower cost health insurance through the Affordable Care Act subsidies. Obviously, this comes with income limitations. There's still income limitations on this, but now in a post-COVID world, those income limitations, instead of kind of being like a cliff where if you go $1 over, you basically shoot yourself in the foot. Now it's kind of more of a modified tiered schedule as you increase. So there's considerations to think about that. Roth conversions, as I've probably mentioned before, the one thing about Roth conversions I'll say is there is basically all the information on the internet that will say you should pursue a Roth conversion. I hesitate on that a little bit because it's really based on your current tax rate today and what you expect your future tax rate to be in retirement or at a future point in life. And so sometimes there's more thought that needs to go into that because I think so many people get caught up in the tax-free growth and converting now, but then later on in life, they're not spending as much money. Maybe it's a more simplistic part of life at that point, and they're actually in a lower tax bracket at that point. Well, you would have been better off just letting the taxes defer and then taking the money at that point. So it's just a very unique circumstance that I always say is very individualized to the individual consumer. So just because you read something online about Roth conversions doesn't necessarily mean they're advisable for your situation. And then obviously a big component of this, anytime you get from, turn age 62 all the way up to age 70, the question of when should I file for Social Security? And that's a big decision as it relates to cash flow planning in retirement, because for a lot of people, Social Security is a big portion of the retirement income. So you want to make sure that you're making the right claiming strategies that would maximize the benefits for you, not only today, but over the course of your life as well. Jake, is there anything that you would add in this that maybe I did not touch on or missed?
I think the key here is just how much they're all interrelated, right? I mean, we plan so much for ultimately what someone will need to spend in retirement, but then the tax impact of all these different decision points, frankly, comes back all of it to goals, right? Whether you choose to convert money to a Roth account or ultimately when you time your Social Security benefits, so much of that comes back to how you will prioritize money decisions, both now for yourself or later for yourself, or perhaps for family or for charity. All these different aspects come back, to those values again, as I was mentioning before. These are strategies that we can use to accomplish, but it doesn't mean you use every arrow in the quiver, right? You use the ones that are most specific to you based on what's important to you. But yeah, I think digging in a bit on each one of these individually makes some sense, just to get a bit more meat to the bones here.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, the first point, qualifying for lower cost healthcare insurance prior to 65, as I mentioned, there are income limitations to this. So you have to have, your income below a certain amount in order to qualify based on family household and things of that nature. So then the question becomes, well, okay, in order to qualify, potentially what bucket of money should I be taking distributions from? And how does this all work back into the overall calculation of what my income ends up being for the year? And so I always say this is a little bit more nuanced because this now goes back into how each bucket gets taxed and how it ends up being transmitted onto your 1040 every year when you file your tax return. So there's a bit of nuance here, but obviously there's different buckets that you can pull from. There could be cash that you have, HSA savings, IRAs, Roth IRAs, taxable monies, things like individual accounts or joint accounts or trust accounts. And so just remember that as you're going through this process, it's very important to understand, how you take your income early on in retirement does actually impact a lot of the decisions that you could potentially be making relative to, Affordable Care Act subsidies and things of that nature. The next one, Roth conversions, I touched on this probably a little bit more in depth than I, maybe should have earlier. But the idea of voluntarily transferring money from your pre-tax IRA, paying a little bit of tax today, and then having that money grow tax-free in your Roth IRA for the rest of your life. And some of this becomes, some people view it as a game, as I'm going to try to time the years in which I have lower tax rates or what I have projected to be a lower tax rate or a projected higher tax rate in the future. I would say this comes with a lot of forecasting of what tax rates will be going forward. And a lot of this comes back to, what your retirement will look like and how much you're spending on a year-to-year basis. And then obviously, you can't predict the future, but, the current tax law as we know it today is set to expire at the end of 2025. So beginning in 2026, the tax code is going to revert back to what it was prior to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. So what that means is the tax rates are going to get a little bit higher. The brackets are going to shrink a little bit. And so a lot of people are asking themselves, well, maybe I should be converting some monies to Roth today, knowing that that's at least coming down the pipeline. And I think those conversations are worthy of having, but I'm always cautious because I get too many people who say, oh, well, my neighbor did this. And it's like, okay, but your neighbor may be in a completely different situation than you. And I'm always hesitant on that because I think there's so much information, there's so much free advice out there now online that people read something, they're like, oh, well, I have to do this. Investopedia is telling me Roth conversions are great, but when it comes back to your own particular situation, that may not always be the case. And then finally, when should I take my Social Security benefit? This is probably one of the most common questions we get as people retire. Should I start early? Should I file later? And I jokingly say sometimes is like, you tell me when you're going to die and I can tell you when to file for Social Security, because really, there's obviously two factors. There's the longevity play, but then there's the cash flow need of today. And how do I manage cash flow? Should I take the distributions from my investments, or should I file for Social Security early? I think it, again, comes back to your plan. Obviously, if you file before your full retirement age, there's a haircut there. But there can certainly be good reasons for why people claim their Social Security benefits earlier. A lot of that is, longevity. If there's not a history of longevity within the family, or maybe there's a medical reason that was provided to them by a doctor that says, you just may not live, as long as XYZ, there's reasons to do it. And I think there's merit to both sides, claiming early and deferring. So it's just important to take your time as you go through that and really identify, how does this work into what I have, in my personal life through personal savings and different things, and where do I go from here? Jake, is there anything you'd like to add on that? I know you've got some unique thoughts on Social Security sometimes.
Social Security is one of those things that, depending on your financial situation, depending on, frankly, whether financial independence is the goal, or retirement for a health reason, or retirement because we know what our fixed income is going to look like, Social Security can be one of those trump cards, things you can play late in life, in that 62 to 70 time frame, sometimes just depending on how large of a portfolio you have to live off of compared to what your Social Security benefits might be. It's nice to have kind of a guarantee from the government that, will provide you anywhere between a 6 and 7% guaranteed increase between taking it early and full retirement age, and then another guarantee of 8% per year from full retirement age all the way to age 70. And those guarantees are there, and the market returns are not always there. So in some cases, taking Social Security sooner could make sense if the market is significantly down in value, and now a withdrawal rate coming out of your investment portfolio is now artificially high because your portfolio is worth less. Taking Social Security sooner might make more sense, even if you have longevity in your family. But the opposite can also be true. If markets are performing reasonably well, and we're in a period of time where your withdrawal rate is very low relative to your means, well, delaying Social Security for as long as possible may help to increase the size of your benefit. It may also leave room in your tax bracket for other strategies. So if you've amassed enough wealth, your withdrawal rate is low enough, you're on a path to leave a legacy to family or to charity, it may then allow for some additional opportunities within a planning perspective to use your existing tax bracket to pursue things like Roth conversions, for example, if family was very important to you. So Social Security is unique in that, it used to be defined as the third leg of the retirement income stool to complement pension and complement distributions out of your investment portfolio. And while it's still important, and in some cases it can be a very large part of the leg of one stool, for some people it can be a very small part of the leg of one stool. So with that becomes a lot more flexibility depending on individual situations there. So Social Security is definitely a unique thing. There used to be many different claiming strategies that you could elect, but Unfortunately, about 8 years ago, during the Budget Act of 2015, the government closed many of the loopholes that were available with Social Security benefits. So it's much more cut and dry now. But I would say the decision of when you take it is very unique and individualized based on many different aspects of your situation.
Yeah, I mean, just adding to what you said, Jake, the one thing that I always hear from people is I want to maximize my benefits. And so, well, when I hear that, it's like I want to truly maximize that lifetime value of my benefits. And, the question of longevity as it relates to Social Security obviously impacts, that decision or that question or that answer. And so when I think about it from the perspective of, okay, well, what does maximization mean to you, maximizing your Social Security benefits? And for most people, they say, well, I want to make sure I get every dollar out of it. And I want to make sure that I get as much money back from the system that I've been paying into, for as long as I have. And sometimes, the reverse question to that is, okay, I understand that. But to your point, Jake, the example you gave earlier, if you're going through a difficult market period in the markets, asset values are temporarily lower, you're relying on your personal savings for distributions, and now your withdrawal rate as a percentage of the assets now is much higher. Wouldn't you be more willing to maximize your lifestyle today by potentially turning on Social Security, even if it doesn't necessarily mean you maximize every dollar, but it provides you a lot more fulfillment today, knowing that in retirement, you're in a much better position from a cash flow perspective and from a distribution planning perspective, that you have a lot more confidence in your plan going forward. I think that carries more merit than any decision as it relates to trying to maximize every dollar that you get back from the government. But everybody's got their own personal opinions on that, but I always like the maximization strategies and the break-even points, because this is where you're able to, try to identify from a numbers basis, this is that. But then there's that emotional component. There's the human element that has to be taken into account. And if you just run the numbers and look at a chart, I think you ignore some of that and some of the emotional kind of comfort benefits that come with it. So just take that into consideration too, as you're kind of thinking through some of those things as well. But Jake, I know you've got some, you go through a unique process relates to going through, projections and Monte Carlo. So I'll turn it back to you now to, touch a little bit more on that.
Whenever we say the word Monte Carlo, people often think of a casino, or perhaps the car that was very prolific in the 70s and 80s. But quite frankly, we go through a lot of statistical analysis. And when you think about it from a financial advisor's perspective, it's what's called Monte Carlo. But basically, it's statistical analysis using projections of future rates of return and inflation and many other factors that go into kind of understanding the merit of someone's financial plan. So when we think about retirement projections, or quite frankly, financial independence projections, right? We use these projections for lots of different reasons, but most of which is for identifying when can someone retire, or if they're on the edge of retirement, how likely they can remain retired without having a substantial risk of ever running out of money, or perhaps accounting for other goals that might be important based on the values that they've articulated at the beginning of establishing that plan. But it comes back, and I think the important word on the chart in the blue box is realistic. So a realistic financial plan as an advisor means something that is very conservative. And I don't mean conservative in terms of targeting low spending amounts or assuming larger rates of return. When we think of realistic, we really think of making sure we identify every possible rock that can be turned over. So if someone says, I think I spend $6,000 a month on all my living expenses, well, we should test the plan based on a much larger amount, just to make sure that we don't understate the value of what the investments could be worth eventually, or assume, for example, that you're going to live a shorter life than a longer life. So using very conservative assumptions when you build out a financial plan that are realistic based on not only today what is real with your budget and real with some of your expectations, but then increasing some of those different periods so that we're making sure that we're being very conservative is very, very important. So that's the first and foremost decision that is kind of rooted back on the values and goals that we've been working on. But I think, Jeff, you wouldn't mind going back just another moment. When you think about stressing the plan, so we use different analysis to help stress test the plan. So we don't just bake one scenario and say, this is the plan. Well, the plan is based in the computer, and a computer assumes the same thing happens every year and basically what we tell it to. So if we don't stress that plan by using many different assumptions and variables to account for lots of potential outcomes, then we haven't done our job to make sure that your plan can have the wherewithal to go through tough markets or the potential of higher spending or unexpected things that might come up or illness. So a lot of the stress testing that we do, or that Monte Carlo, statistical analysis that we perform, helps to give us a higher confidence level that someone ultimately might not run out of money. Now, it's interesting when you think about statistical analysis. Most engineers that we work with want the plan to be 100% foolproof. Because as an engineer, if you develop a part, for example, for an airplane, and that airplane needs to fly in the sky and transport 100 to 200 passengers without fault ever, well, there has to be a 99.9999% likelihood that that part is not going to fail. Financial planning is not the same. It's not black or white. Unfortunately, a lot of what we do is working in the gray. So when you think about what is a percentage of probability that someone may never run out of money that is comfortable for us, that's oftentimes somewhere between 75 and 85%. So someone might say, well, that introduces a 15 to 25% chance of failure. And that's true. But if you think about that airplane, from the moment it takes off until the moment it lands, the pilot, just like an advisor, has the plan. They know what the flight path is going to be. They know how they're going to get from point A to point B. They generally know the weather conditions when they take off. They are aware of the other air traffic that is out there. But when they get in the plane and they take off and are ultimately at their cruising altitude, the plan changes. They may have to lower their altitude for other planes or because of weather. They may have to divert course a bit one direction or the other because of unforeseen things that have come up. So that that idea of when you take off the plane and the plan is going to change once you're in the air, and more than 90% of the time, that plane does not follow its intended flight path. And the same is true with financial planning. So we don't just set and forget a plan at the very beginning, but allow this plan to be a living, breathing organism that we come back and readjust assumptions on a regular basis to make sure that the plan is always staying in front of us. It is directionally correct, and it's providing us guidance, but it can never be foolproof, unfortunately, because a lot of what we have to do is we have to have markets help grow our portfolio, which is the most unpredictable thing that is out there. So adjusting as necessary along the way is just as important as a pilot flying the plane. And that's certainly what this process is for. But it kind of gets rooted in a lot of questions. So when you think about the questions that we often will get, I think as an advisor and you individually, if you're listening, you often think, well, my situation is unique. I have a very unique situation where I'd like to retire early and update a kitchen, add a screen porch, or hey, I want to retire tomorrow and buy a vacation home. Well, those might be unique goals in your own mind, but from an advisor's perspective, when we're working with many different people, most times people are very similar. So you have a lot of similar goals and values, perhaps, but the actual detail work behind the scenes might make that situation a bit more unique. But these are questions we get all the time. How do I retire early? How do I maintain my current lifestyle? If I do want to retire a little early and make changes, large home expensive projects, how can I consider that as part of my plan? Or if I want to buy a vacation home, is it going to be feasible now or feasible later? Or frankly, if I want to retire later, how much more budget will that give me for travel or perhaps other wants or wishes, as Jeff was articulating before? Jeff, any comments you want to add here in terms of other very common questions that we'll get from time to time?
No, I think this covers a lot of them. I mean, I think the biggest question that I think all of this relates back to is, am I going to run out of money? Right? Like that's the overlying common question that we get. And I think a lot of these are subsets of that question. And so these are probably more, I guess, in the detail, because I think what a lot of people are always trying to solve for is like, am I going to make it all the way to the end? Like, am I still going to have money left over? And ultimately, that's what a lot of the exercises and going through is identifying for. But within that question, there are a series of questions similar to this that all relate back to that.
I think you're exactly right. The question I know I got a lot back in 2008 and 2009 was, am I okay? That idea that am I okay now and will I be okay? That's really what most people want to know. But exactly right. There's so many other detailed facets of the am I okay question that we go through, and that's okay. That's what this plan and process is for. So the next slide really addresses a screenshot of a software that we'll use to help review through different assumptions. So there's a lot going on here, but the meter is the most important part. And the purple, green, and blue meter down in the middle section of this slide really articulates kind of the likelihood of someone funding all of those needs and wants and wishes over their lifetime in various market conditions. So when we think about that statistical analysis, it's based in someone's asset allocation of how much stocks or bonds or alternative investments they may have. It's based in someone's spending needs. And when you think about a base scenario, let's say someone wanted to retire at age 60, and we put through all of these different assumptions. We've identified basic living costs and healthcare, and perhaps a country club membership or purchasing a new home. So you have all these different factors built in. Well, for this person, 95% of the 1,000 different retirement simulations that are running behind the scenes showed this person not running out of money and funding all of their spending goals. Now, that is a really good result. I actually would articulate, and look at this a bit deeper and say, all right, well, if you're in that blue section where you have such a high probability of success, that might make you feel great because maybe your goal is to grow your asset base. But in some cases, that's a little chance of failure from an advisor's perspective because you might not be balancing life enough to enjoying what you have already today. Now, the purple the purple zone is where we're under our confidence zone of that 75 to 85% that I had mentioned before. And that's where, frankly, some changes might need to be made to make the plan a little bit better. But in that first scenario, this obviously worked out really well. Well, let's say someone said, I want to retire earlier. I retire at age 57, so 3 years sooner. How does that impact the likelihood of me ever running out of money over my lifetime? Well, as you can see, it may affect what is ultimately left under that safety margin in the middle of the screen, might affect what is left at the end of someone's plan, but it didn't impact the probability. So the likelihood of them maintaining their income and funding all their spending goals over their life was still very strong, even retiring a little bit sooner. So as someone that has this much success, you go a step further and say, well, I want to retire at 60, but now I'd like to purchase a very large, vacation home or a second home or perhaps a replacement for my existing home. Well, that now has a more substantial impact on the confidence zone, but it still puts it at the top end of the range for us to still have comfort that someone can retire and choose to, align with this goal, which is probably important, from a values perspective to them to have, perhaps having a different place to live and work eventually down the road. And then the last piece is, all right, well, if age 60 and buying a home is logical and that could make some sense, what if I push the envelope, retired a little sooner, but then I actually save a little bit more to my investment assets until that point in time? And that, too, in this scenario, that is possible because the likelihood of success is still quite strong. And it's just moving the different levers behind the scenes to try to identify what's going to be the best plan that we should lay. That right now is the plan, but we have to make adjustments perhaps moving forward. So this robust analysis can be a really helpful tool. It is not the exact answer all of the time, but it can be a really helpful tool for us to help validate whether someone's plan, which was realistic on the front end, has been stress tested enough and will be reasonable moving forward. So you get to this point, you've realized retirement is, potentially very close, or, you want to move on and perhaps have a victory lap and do something else different than what you've done to, accumulate wealth over your lifetime. Now it's time to pull the trigger. So when we think about that, it's, well, of course, a lot of questions you have to consider, as we've answered here today. So how do you think about replacing your paycheck? Once you've identified what your needs are, what your wants are, what your wishes are, then figuring out how it will be drawn from different buckets, as Jeff was talking about before, that really comes back to understanding how you will replace your paycheck. And quite frankly, it also impacts how will my taxes change in retirement? Because you may be earning wages and paying regular income tax on wages up until the time of retirement, or not saving any longer and living off your assets. But then taking money back out of your investment accounts, the tax picture does change. And that tax picture is very dependent on the types of investments you have going into retirement, or the types of income sources you'll be able to achieve in retirement, and then ultimately how you receive those back out. But so much of this too is aligned with, okay, well, making sure not only just replacing my paycheck, but what about things that are unexpected? There could be a roof that I have to replace. There could be, a major damage that occurs to one of my vehicles, and perhaps I'm not properly insured. What about these unexpected expenditures that could happen? What about long-term care? How will I plan for some of these pieces? So that is part of the planning process that you have to, build out when you think about setting realistic expectations for it as well. And then I think the other two that are on here that are important is my asset allocation and my portfolio aligned with my plan? There was the old rules of thumb that said that, hey, if you took 100 minus your age, that's how much you should have in stocks, or the riskiest category of investments going into your future. So that would say for someone that is 60 years old, they should only have 40% of their money in stocks and the rest in bonds, perhaps. Well, that worked well when people only had maybe 12 to 15 years in retirement because life expectancy was a lot shorter. Or when someone was in the situation where retirement was just about them and they didn't want to ultimately leave a legacy. But that really isn't very applicable any longer. Most often, you have to have a portfolio that is geared more towards stock than bond when you retire, but it's not the case for everyone. So asset allocation aligned with your plan, the goal is to identify what the right asset allocation is that leaves you with the highest confidence that you'll never run out of money, while still delivering you peace of mind that you don't have to have so much at risk in the market where you may lose sleep at night leading into retirement or immediately afterwards. And finally, having a team of professionals in place. So having an advisor to help coach around some of these considerations, a CPA to help not only prepare your taxes, but hopefully align tax strategy along with the advisor and working in concert, and then having an estate planning attorney. So thinking about those values that we established at the beginning, if not being a burden on your family is something that keeps you awake, make sure your estate plan is in good order. If it hasn't had any attention, one of those checklist items as you lead to retirement is one of the things that you should consider taking care of, because I think it'll give you the peace of mind to move forward and be more retirement ready as time goes on. Jeff, anything else you think from a questions perspective that isn't on this list here that you might have heard before or seems to be really important?
No, I think you covered it in pretty great detail there. I think as part of the process to help identify these questions and really just where to get started, I think that's where we really dive into what here at Savant we call our health assessment, our Ideal Futures Financial Health Assessment. And this is really meant to be a starting point or a benchmark to track progress made over time. And so going through an assessment, identifying where you're at in the 10 key areas today is really important, because you have to have a starting point. You can't create a path to go forward unless you have a starting point. And then, trying to identify what that end point will be, what's going to help you get from feeling maybe a little bit, below confidence level in a certain category to make you feel super confident that you're in a really good, in a really good spot from that perspective. And so I like it when people go through this, because it really allows them to bring everything to the forefront and puts everything here on pen and paper and allows them a starting point. And then from there, identifying, okay, well, where should I start? I mean, that's really important. So you should see a link coming through into the chat here for this. If you'd like to take the assessment, go ahead and click on that link here in the chat. That way you can kind of see where you stand today. And then from there, hopefully be able to identify a path going forward on that. But then from there, Jake, I know we've got some time here for some questions and things of that nature. Before we get to that, just wanted to have everybody, I just wanted to mention, you can join our Retirement Readiness Challenge as well. There'll be some more information on that as it comes about. But then if you have more questions and you would like to connect, feel free to schedule a 15-minute call using the link in the chat as well. We're more than happy to answer questions as it relates to your situation and where you're at today. And then obviously the most fun part is the disclosures as well for everybody. So here's those. But then Jake, I guess let's go ahead and let's open up the Q&A format for people so we can start getting to some of their questions. One of the questions that came in early on in the segment when we were talking about Social Security, the question came from Dan here in Illinois was, how do you navigate the conversation of somebody who knows they may not have a longer life expectancy and is in a position where they feel like they should take Social Security a little bit earlier? How do you navigate that conversation? Probably knowing that it's a little bit more of an emotional conversation at that point.
Yeah, I think taking it early it can be okay. I think when we had one of the slides up on screen that identified, that really was the total amount of benefits someone receives over their lifetime. And when you really quantify the amount of benefits someone receives over their lifetime by taking it early versus at full retirement age or later in life, the dollar amount isn't so significant that if you've planned well for other items, it'll wreck your plan. So again, that idea of having the answer to Social Security be very unique to you and your specific situation is true. And taking it early shouldn't be something where it's like, oh, I feel bad that I couldn't have waited to full retirement age or later on. It may have to be part of your plan, and you may have to be okay with it. But the reality is, it's not a ton of money that ends up being left on the table. And if you've otherwise planned well on other income sources, again, shouldn't put you in a position where you're going to, wreck your financial plan or have to make other significant adjustments.
Yeah, no, I'd completely agree with that. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head there. So I won't add too much there. We had a couple questions come through about, they're all kind of related to potentially how do I go about reducing, income today if I'm in a higher tax bracket. At a high level, obviously continue taking advantage of the tax deferred nature of, employer sponsored 401k plans, HSA accounts. Those are all great ways to reduce income today. From that perspective, business owners also have opportunities to create and offer retirement plans for their employees as well that allow them to create tax deferred savings for them as the business owner. So really take advantage of those 401k plans offered to you through your employer, in addition to, HSA savings as well, health savings accounts, because those are all great ways that you can reduce your income today, when you may find yourself in a higher tax bracket than what you may foresee yourself in the future.
The only thing I add to that, Jeff, is, when you think about taxable income, we also think about, right, your income after deductions. So if another motivator is to reduce taxable income for whatever reason, and this would be a reason to obviously connect with a financial advisor, well, you could be more charitably inclined, and that could reduce your income. Or perhaps you could prepay property taxes for a future year if you expect one year to be higher from an income perspective than others. So there's lots of different ways you can adjust your taxable income depending on your individual situation. But I think more importantly, when you think about lowering income taxes, do so over someone's lifetime as opposed to just any one year. And that's where some of these longer term strategies can be important.
Yeah, and then last question, we get this question a lot. Should we be thinking about possible cuts to Social Security given the current state of, the federal government and where it stands with the budget? Jake, I'll have you chime in as well. My professional take on this is, for those who are currently on Social Security or claiming getting close to claiming Social Security, it's probably not going to change too much for you. I think for, people of a certain age, maybe, 50 or 45 or younger, it may look different for us going forward, just based on, how they define full retirement age, or, how they, calculate benefits going forward. But I always go back to, there's a lot of debate on this, and actually the solutions to solve the problem are very easy. It really just comes down to the people who are in charge of making those decisions, in fact, making those decisions. Probably the easiest, couple of the easiest ones is either increasing the full retirement age, or quite frankly, getting rid of the cap on earnings subject to Social Security. So right now that cap is about $145,000. Once your income exceeds that amount, you don't pay into Social Security anymore at that point. That's quite honestly the easiest way to fund the program going forward. But right now it's just a political issue. So Jake, I don't know if you've got anything else you would add there.
That's the key. It's politicians want to get reelected, and the hard thing for them is to make a very difficult, not necessarily irrevocable decision on how Social Security taxation occurs or how benefits will be withheld for, certain categories of individuals. But if they do that, they have to worry about their voter base and the impact that their voter base may feel and frankly the votes they'll receive. So many politicians are nervous to introduce big sweeping changes. So it's probably going to continue to be a series of small changes over long periods of time to continue pushing the decision on long-term Social Security benefits year after year after year. I suspect it'll be out there for a long time before we get any real, major uplifting changes to the overall Social Security system.
Yeah. No, I would agree. So, well, with that being said, I know we're coming up at the top of the hour. Again, thank you all for joining today. It was a pleasure having all of you. Jay, thanks again for joining me for this. We hope you found the information useful. And if you have any questions or you want more information about Savant, feel free to go to our website, savantwealth.com.
Thank you.